When it comes to systems, you want something that will start showing results fast. You're looking for a tool that can enable your 3PL or warehouse to get to the next level. So why wait? That's why Carton Cloud provides supported, fast onboarding that can have your WMS up and running in hours, not months. Jump into Carton Cloud's easy-to-use workflows for all of your services, including cross-docking, serialized inventory tracking, e-commerce order fulfillment, and more. This software is built by logistics people for logistics people, and those logistics people are standing by to help train you and support you so that you can be successful with your customer. With 24/7 real-time reporting and free online training, you need to check out Carton Cloud for your operation. Take the next step in your operation by heading to cartoncloud.com/free-demo or click the link in the show notes.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Jason Finkelstein, who is the co-founder and partner over at Logistics Resolve. And they're focused on healing some broken relationships in between 3PLs and brands and making sure that, you can come to terms and make sure that things can keep going smoothly and repairing relationships versus breaking them apart, which I think we can all appreciate in the logistics world and also in our personal lives too. I think that's a good thing. So we're going to talk to Jason about some of these relationship issues that pop up and what some of the risks may be by ending those relationships, and also a little bit about his background and how he came to be a co-founder of Logistics Resolve. So Jason, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks, Kevin. I'm doing well. I'm really excited to be here today. I appreciate you having us on.
Definitely happy to get you on. Happy to talk about this. I think it's very interesting what you've launched here, and I'm very interested to kind of dig into this and where it came from too. I think it's an interesting story. So why don't you kind of start by giving us kind of an overview of your background and how that kind of led up and built up to Logistics Resolve?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So a little bit about my background. I've been in the operations supply chain space for about 10 years or so. And about 5 years ago, I was lucky enough to kind of stumble into the world of e-commerce. When I joined a small t-shirt brand out of San Diego at the time called Fresh Clean Tees, I was hired there to lead operations and essentially scale up the business from the small company that it was into a large enterprise apparel manufacturer. And, over the course of 4 years doing that, I oversaw supply chain, logistics, customer experience, our manufacturing, encountered a lot of issues as we scaled up, had a lot of big wins. And the area that I kept coming back to was fulfillment, which was a big challenge. We used an outsourced network. We used several 3PLs over the course of my time. And what I started to notice is that the relationship aspect, getting the performance, getting the cost that you wanted as a brand operations leader was really tricky. And then when I talked to other brand leaders, folks in my position at similar companies that were scaling that had a big e-commerce footprint, I heard the same refrain. Hey, I hate my 3PL, or things are really bad, or we want to switch. I think it's almost like a tired trope in the industry by this time. And then, when I talked to 3PL partners or other connections in the industry from the 3PL side, I heard a lot of similar things of, hey, this business is really tough. The margins are really slim in fulfillment. The customer expectations are extremely high. There's a big variability between the types of brands that any given fulfillment center will serve, even if they have a really narrow kind of ICP profile. Mm-hmm. And so, as I started to think about this and left Fresh Clean Threads, I thought, hey, this is one of the biggest issues in the industry that we could potentially solve. And I started talking to someone who I'd met who actually was at a 3PL that we utilized at Fresh Clean Threads, Dan Cole, who has a long history sort of, so to speak, on the other side of the table.
Yeah.
He started his own 3PL, worked as an exec at several of them. And we started looking at the market and said, hey, there's a ton of solutions out there that are focused around getting you to your next 3PL, helping run your RFP, helping transition. But there's really nothing out there that, from what our perspective, prevents sort of the biggest lose-lose in business, which is when you actually have to terminate and transfer your 3PL, or the other way around, the 3PL decides, hey, this customer is no longer a fit for us for whatever reason, go find a new provider. And so that's sort of the story of how Logistics Resolve came about. We asked ourselves, hey, instead of adding another solution to the market of, hey, can you switch to your new 3PL? What if we worked on sort of the root cause of this and tried to figure out a way to maintain these relationships and make them win-win for both sides?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that makes so much sense. And shout out to Dan, by the way, as well. You mentioned there, good friend. And yeah, I mean, I think, there is so much of that kind of talk in the industry. Like you said, like, oh, I hate my 3PL, or like 3PLs suck, or like, a lot of companies too, where, had bad 3PL experiences and they're like, oh, I'm going to go do my own fulfillment. And then they end up starting a 3PL too, because they're like, oh, I can do it better than these ones that did it before that did a horrible job for me. Right. Which is unfortunate, obviously, that there's that kind of discourse in the relationship there between the brands and the 3PL side. But I mean, I think it makes so much sense to now have you guys come in and try to resolve some of these issues, because I think, some of these issues maybe depending on, personalities involved and things like that, like they may not be as big of an issue, but they may not be able to kind of see it from an outside perspective, because either they're like personally invested in the brand and, they have an attachment to their business and things like that. Or maybe, there's a misunderstanding because, they don't have necessarily an operational background, or the 3PL maybe wasn't the right fit from the beginning, and all these different things that can happen. So I'm curious, I mean, as you start to evaluate some of these and as you've talked to people within the market, I mean, what are some of the common reasons that you're seeing for 3PLs and brands to start having, issues in the first place?
Yeah, I absolutely happy to speak to that. And, I want to touch on one thing. You're totally right in that these relationships are so critical to both sides. As a brand, this is arguably your most important supplier relationship, your most important outside partner relationship. It's, you hear a lot, the last line of defense between you and your customers, shaping that customer experience. And then obviously as a fulfillment center, this is your business, right? So these are really, really, really high pressure and high importance relationships. So, what are the big things that we see causing issues? From our experience, and then a bunch of case studies and actually some research that we've done on this, we see 5 kind of big issues that are what start to chip away at, kind of go from this big, honeymoon, we're excited to start a new partnership, it's all blue sky, to, oh boy, we're having some issues. And so there's 2 that are for the 3PL, 2 for the brand, and then 1 that kind of unites them together. On the 3PL side, the 2 big issues that we see are forecasting problems and then scope changes. And so, the first one is, in most relationships, 3PLs request some sort of forecast, typically at the daily level, 30 days projected, both units and orders, so that they can plan effectively to execute that work. Particularly for brands that are primarily D2C, that ship a lot of e-commerce, this is extremely difficult to provide with a high degree of accuracy. And so, one of the big issues for 3PLs is, hey, we get a forecast. If it's too high, then, hey, we've staffed a bunch of associates, people are sitting around twiddling their thumbs, and it really drives on our bottom line. And then, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because if the forecast's low and then the brand exceeds it, then you've got a bunch of orders sitting there and you're really struggling to get them out. In terms of scope changes, what we see a lot is that, maybe there was a great fit when the brand onboarded and, hey, this is our business profile, this is what we do. But, things change, the market changes, customers demand, new channels, new geographies, new ways to get the product. And so business profile might change. And suddenly you're adding kind of ancillary services on top that may not be, that the 3PL may well be positioned to execute, but they didn't plan for that when they set up the account. And so a lot of times, what we see is there's kind of a scope creep from a 3PL's perspective of, hey, here's some onesie, twosie things that we need you to do. But then From the brand perspective, we're actually changing strategy, right? This is going to be a big new channel for us, and that gets lost in the weeds a little bit. And then there is every once in a while what we call kind of scope change that isn't really scope change, where there might have been some miscommunication during the RFP or onboarding process, and there's a lack of understanding around, hey, this was actually the scope that we meant to be executed, but it feels to the 3PL like scope change. And then when you look at the brand side, the two big issues that we found so far, and they're broad, right, are SLA performance and then just general visibility into the operation of your cost. So SLA performance, fairly self-explanatory, however, can get very kind of nuanced as you dig in. Sometimes it's, okay, you committed to 99% on-time shipping, you're hitting 97, and we're upset about that, right? Totally makes sense. But sometimes it's, maybe you're hitting the KPIs in the contracts, but all of our big orders are having mispicks. And maybe you're still at 99% accuracy, but these high value customers are having problems. Or maybe the inbounding is within SLA, but certain high priority loads aren't getting in, as hot as a brand might want. So, and then it could be all the way to, hey, I calculate this number this way, you're calculating it differently. So, who's right? And then the final piece on the brand side that we see is just that general visibility, which could mean a lot of things. Commonly, we see it come up in terms of cost and invoicing, where it's, hey, we're getting hit with these invoices, these costs, labor hours, whatever it might be, and we don't know why we're getting them or where they're coming from or what the approval was. But then it could be all the way from visibility to the operation of, hey, we don't have the right reporting or we don't have the right understanding of why you're doing certain things. And so those are sort of the two separate issues for each side. And then there's one that kind of underpins everything, which is just around communication and alignment. And, hey, are we talking frequently enough? Are we talking about the right things? Are we actually resolving the things that we're talking about? And, we sort of like to look at it as communication is basically the first and the last issue that we work on, because any issue can be made better or worse depending on the quality of communication that's coming through. So those are sort of the big 5 areas that we've been seeing most that get these relationships off track.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of things there too, like, especially from like the e-commerce and D2C side, like especially as a lot of these brands are kind of just starting out or something, and all of a sudden they see whether it's explosive growth or they see like a new market opportunity to go into, like you see a lot of different challenges with that, especially like it's kind of in the first two that you mentioned there with the scope creep and then the forecasting issues as well. And it certainly can be frustration points on both ends, whether you're exceeding the forecast like tremendously, which is like great, right? In terms of like for like the brand, but then and it's great for the 3PL in the long term, but like the immediate reaction is like, oh my, like how am I gonna keep up with this? We got to bring in more labor. We got to figure out different things to be able to handle this. And, how do I manage that with my other clients too? And things like that, so it creates these kind of frustration points. But I mean, I'm curious, like, of those kind of common problems, I mean, how do you start to become maybe like more proactive or try to, get ahead of some of those problems and do some maybe preventative measures when you're entering into the relationship or when you're doing, your check-ins to try and maybe avoid some of those, like getting to the point of frustration?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and kind of in an ideal world, right? No one ever needs logistics resolved. Everything gets resolved, internally. The first one is to acknowledge, hey, there are going to be issues. Perfect is not the objective. And it's almost like a mindset shift from both sides. So basically saying, hey, we're going to encounter issues, but our job as partners is to, presume good intentions and then sit side by side and work to fix them. So I think that's sort of the first big thing. And then, the second is just around the communication aspect that, we like to sort of divide communication into 2 big buckets. One is everything that goes on day to day, right? And for those things, you're looking at, hey, what's the speed of response from both sides? What's the speed of resolution from both sides? What's actually the quality of the resolution? And making sure that both sides feel really good about all 3 of those things, because it only takes one for things to start to break down. And then in the second big bucket, of communication, I think, is really where you start to identify these things. And we refer to these as the real talk, kind of the heart to heart, if you will, between whether it's top leadership or whether it's day-to-day working teams of hey, how am I actually serving your business? How am I as a client for you? Is this what you expected? Where are the things going wrong? And I think what happens a lot is that leaders are very busy, right? You're jumping from kind of fire to fire, but in our experience, it's really important to kind of pull back and have these check-ins. And it might not be at QBRs, right? Because those are big audiences, a lot of people in the room, and sometimes the conversation actually needs to be about the people in the room, right? So these are more kind of top-to-top conversations that should be happening with some frequency, depending on the complexity of the depth and the state of the relationship, that I think oftentimes get glossed over, just given people are busy and often running from thing to thing. And sometimes it's easier to ignore a problem that is butting up than really facing it head on.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's great to, like you said, make sure that you're having those touch points like earlier on, and not necessarily at the QBR, like you mentioned, right? Like, don't wait to, if it's 1 month into the quarter, like, don't wait until the QBR to say there's a problem, right? I mean, like, bring it up earlier and try to be proactive, I think, on both ends, right? And have that understanding too of how are you communicating those things. And, I think it's really interesting to do that. But and I'm curious now on the relationship side, right? So, what are some of because obviously you guys are trying to resolve these issues, right? And you're trying to like repair these relationships and try and keep them as ongoing relationships, right? I think like at the end of the day, like, you don't want to, break that relationship is your goal as Logistics Resolve. So tell us a little bit about, what are some of the, I guess, risks of, ending the relationship versus, trying to resolve it, right? Instead of, just saying like, oh, I can't deal with this anymore, and we're done, right? We're pulling our brand out, right? But what are the risks of doing that?
We'll be back after a quick break.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Do you want more warehouse content delivered to your inbox? Sign up for our new email series called Warehouse Wisdom Wednesday to get an educational series of emails on warehouse basics delivered directly to you every Wednesday morning. Find the sign up link in the show notes.
Yeah, totally. And it's a really good question. I think I mentioned the phrase earlier, but we look at these terminations and, we kind of call it the biggest lose-lose in business. It's definitely the biggest lose-lose in supply chain. I'm sure someone could find a bigger lose-lose in all of business, but we haven't heard it yet. And there's a few reasons why we say that, right? From the 3PL side, I think it's a little bit more apparent or easy to grasp. What is the big downside when a client leaves, or even when you have to terminate a client? First and foremost, you're losing whatever sort of revenue margin forecast you had against that client. And it might even be, worse than simply what that margin is, because now you have empty square footage. So the margin hit could be even worse. In the worst scenario, you actually have idle CapEx that you've significantly invested in that now is not productive, or maybe you have to find a very specific client profile that might go fill that. Obviously on this podcast, you talk a lot about automation, and this is one of the big risks of that. And then, from the more, kind of human and personnel side of things, these could result in big staffing cuts, right? If you don't need the associates to fulfill an account, you can't keep them around. And I think that, not only is a tough move, but it really hurts the morale in a company, right? When there's cuts, when the clients are leaving. And then, these exits often get very sticky. And so your top leadership is going to be focused on negotiating the exit, refilling the space, all of that sort of ancillary activity, which is distracting them from their big priorities that they might have. And as we look at as we see the market right now, what we hear from a lot of 3PLs is, hey, there's way fewer RFPs than there used to be. There's a lot fewer opportunities coming across our desk, and so we believe, hey, the best the best revenue that you have is the revenue that's already in the building, right? So work hard to fix that. And then conversely, on the brand side, I think this one, is a bit less intuitive, and a lot of brand leaders will think, hey, if we just shift our 3PL, all of our issues are going to go away, right? And you're hearing kind of in your ear from 3PL salespeople, maybe competitive salespeople,
Yeah.
I can't believe they're doing that, or, that's ridiculous. I've never heard about that, right? So there's sort of this push of, oh yeah, just, switch over and it'll be all good. I think what we, find a lot is unless a brand has really looked kind of internally at its own operations of what might have, we've been doing to contribute to some of the issues that we're facing, oftentimes those same issues or similar issues are going to pop up at your new facility and your new partner. And you're certainly not going to be at steady state for, depending on the complexity of the account, anywhere from 3 to 9 months, right? It's going to take time to ramp up, time to get back. And what we really talk a lot about is the actual transition is incredibly risky and incredibly expensive. And so we've done a bunch of case studies on brands that have moved their fulfillment center, whether on their own volition or been terminated by this 3PL and had to go find a new partner. What we find is that it typically costs 10 to 25% of a fulfillment plus small parcel budget annually.
Wow. Right.
So really, really big costs that not all brands are necessarily expecting or prepared to absorb. And then you have this transitionary period where your website may not be fully stocked. So you're missing sales because, your goods are on a truck, versus sellable in a warehouse, or maybe they're back in the incumbent. You've already switched your integrations over to the new one. And then you're losing LTV because for the customers that did purchase, those orders are being delayed most often, right? So you kind of have that both acquisition hit and customer LTV hit. And then kind of lastly, and this is similar to what I spoke about on the 3PL side, this is a big, big deal, within a brand to shift 3PLs. There's big business continuity risk. So your board is going to be involved or have close eyes on it. Oftentimes senior leadership, including the CEO, is going to be asking about this every Monday morning, as our other departments who are having trouble fulfilling their, KPIs. And, I've been through this. I've talked to many people that have gone through this as well. And so, let alone you're not really going to be able to accomplish any other operations team priorities within, call it 6 months of doing this move, both before and after, because this is such a, kind of high stakes and high stress type of situation. So that's sort of why we say, hey, before you, kick off your RFP, before you look to change, let's just slow down and make sure that we've done everything possible to make sure that we're hitting the performance, cost, whatever your objectives are with your incumbent, because you never know what's going to be on the other side or in that transition.
Yeah. I think that's a lot of great points there, because it's not as easy as just like changing your cell phone provider, right, or something like that, right? Which even in some cases is not that easy. But there's a lot to go into account there, and especially if you carry a lot of inventory as well, then there's like a whole gap of when is that inventory going to be available again, like you said. So there's definitely like a lot of risk there on both sides. So it makes sense to try and resolve those issues and those conflicts and try and keep the relationship going, so that both sides are kind of finding a way to win in a sense. And I think based on some of the common reasons for some of these issues coming up that you mentioned earlier on, a lot of them are pretty, able to, if you're open-minded, like you can easily kind of navigate those and figure out, why, how do we kind of, because a lot of them are, I think spurred from either growth or unexpected lack of growth in a sense, but like, how do we kind of take those and make positives and win on both sides together to be able to grow together. So I think it's very interesting, this kind of unique relationship. And I think I saw you guys, when you launched it, you kind of likened it to a marriage, which I've seen that kind of analogy a couple times around the 3PL brand relationship in a sense, but it truly is like a commitment to, grow together, because you are very invested, very committed, like trusting people with your inventory. And at the end of the day, trusting people with your customers as well from the brand perspective. So I'm curious, you talk us through a little bit, through that mediation process a little bit, that logistics resolve kind of brings to the table, and how does that work for someone who's maybe in one of these situations right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So if folks are in a situation that's kind of ripe for us to come in, it might be, hey, there's general dissatisfaction on both sides that maybe is trending negatively. Maybe there's a big renewal coming up that's acting as a forcing function for both sides. Or maybe, one of the sides has indicated already, like, we're out. And these are often caused by, like, both sides are feeling, both, or, at least one side is feeling big financial pain. There's usually a lack of trust, due to maybe commitments that were perceived as broken. And there's that heightened, emotional tension that comes from it. So, these are the sorts of situations that we often walk into. And, the way that it'll actually look for the two sides is fairly straightforward. So, we start by having both sides basically agree to bring us on. Depending on the specific type of engagement, maybe one side will pay all or more, but we like to recommend that both parties actually split it. And so, you sort of have this consent from both sides to say, hey, we are looking to salvage this. We want to bring in a third party to, try to break some of the impasses that we are having. And so we'll start with each side separately, talk to them and really do, kind of in-depth interviews with, stakeholders on each side, maybe an hour or so per person that has exposure, and try to get in those interviews to what are actually the big issues. What does each side care about and what is going wrong? They're not really around solutioning, yet, right? They're more just, okay, let's figure out all of the different things that we need to address, and kind of what each side wants out of this relationship. And then really, like, the meat of it is we bring both parties together. This might be for a few hours, it might be for half a day, it could be up to a day, depending on how, we haven't seen anything more than a day yet, but I'm sure it'll happen eventually. Yeah. Because they're meaty issues. And so basically out of those discovery sessions, out of the individual conversations, we now have our agenda. We now have our list of, hey, these are all the things that need to be talked through. The way that we do this is it's Dan and I both have taken courses and gotten certification in commercial mediation. And so a lot of that, what we do is based on that discipline, which is in all kinds of industries, legal, insurance, construction, et cetera, but hasn't been done yet in logistics. And, across commercial mediation, there's 85% success rate. And so we basically take those principles and, the biggest ones are, hey, we want the two sides to actually work it out. So we're just there to facilitate the discussion and make sure it stays, above board, solution oriented, on track. And then, we can also be there to provide, a dose of reality or an unbiased opinion, as needed. But really our job there is to get both sides talking and really in a solution oriented mindset versus, blaming or, trying to get as much as you possibly can, kind of cut the pie in two ways type of mindset. And so, we basically do this, and coming out of these, facilitated sessions, we have now commitments from each side of, hey, this is how we're going to act differently. Maybe this is how billing is going to look. Maybe this is, how communication is going to look. And then, I started my career in consulting. I know that the best presentations ever, you can come back on Monday and it can be like nothing ever happened. Right. So, ideally that doesn't happen, but I've definitely seen it. And so that's why our solution, we stick around, right? So we have those commitments, and what we'll do is, depending on, what the engagement calls for, it might be as much as bi-weekly, it could be, more like quarterly, is we'll actually track those commitments, and it might be KPIs, it might be milestones, and basically make sure is each side hitting what they said they were going to hit? Do they need any support? Are there new issues that are coming up? And so we want to really kind of keep a pulse on the relationship and make sure that the tenor stays how it was when we brought everyone together versus how it was, maybe a couple months before that.
Yeah. I love that approach, because I think, it's one thing, like you said, you put the whole plan together, and then you're kind of, if you're like pushing the action on them to, stick to the plan and stuff like that, then they might just, find themselves back where they were originally, essentially, right? So I love that you're kind of sticking with them and making sure that, these things that were agreed upon are getting hit, and, adding that third party too in, I think, helps to alleviate some of the tension maybe that's had been built up over time in a sense. And because at the end of the day, I mean, it's really, it's the human element, right? That kind of, gets in the way in a sense. And, having somebody with like a fresh set of eyes look at it and, kind of guide you through, that's not necessarily impartial to either side. You're kind of you're almost the Switzerland, I guess, of the logistics world in a sense, right? You're neutral to all the parties. So, it really helps to kind of guide that and, guide them to overall resolution and hopefully, a long continued relationship throughout. So very interesting what you guys have developed here and what you're focusing on. I mean, I think it's a great idea and I think it's a great thing to bring to the industry to help resolve a lot of these problems that probably, didn't have to necessarily end relationships and could have, kept things going and worked things out. So it's great to have that third party and new set of eyes to look at a problem and help resolve that. So very interesting stuff with you here, Jason, and definitely appreciate you coming on the show today to talk about this. If people are finding problems in their own logistics marriages, what's the best way to get in touch with you and learn more about Logistics Resolve?
Yeah, absolutely. No, appreciate that, Kevin. And it's been great being on with you here today. Best way to get in contact is either on LinkedIn, Jason Finkelstein, or email, jason@logisticsresolve.com. Or they can pop over to our website, www.logisticsresolve.com, to get some more info, and they can contact us through there.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well, so people can easily find it. So, Jason, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.